session of Irish History from the Hedgerow at the Irish Roots Cafe, produced by IrishRoots.com with Peter Riley Adams and Michael O'Loughlin. Find a spot on the warm, sunny side of the hedgerow now. Today's session is about to begin. They were rough, unpolished men, brilliant scholars, teaching by the side of the road, in small rooms, in nooks and crannies, wherever and whenever possible. Such men as these, they were the teachers of the hedge.
When I was a gossoon of 8 years or so, with me turf and me primer, to school I did go. Hi-dee-dee-dum-dee-dee-day. I went to a schoolhouse without any floor. Hi-dee-dee-dee-dee-dee-dee-day.
Well, welcome to today's session at the hedgerow, and before we start, class will start here formally in a few minutes, but I thought I'd make a mention since this is our special edition on the Hedge Schools, and that's what we're named for here. Might tell you a little bit about why I voted for this name for the series. And I put it out on a blog, and I entitled it, I Never Carried the Sod. And it talks about the Irish Hedge School heritage in general and how they were founded in the 17th century under the penal laws. And the Catholics were prevented from teaching or building a school, and under penalty of law, if anybody tried to cross that barrier of having a building or even a house to teach in. That brought about those outlaw teachers that went out and taught the children and traveling strangers in the open air. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. And, one of the children there, one of the students might serve as a lookout for the authorities. You know, that reminds me of when I was a boy and we played Cowboys and Indians. That made it a lot more fun. I don't know how it was back then. It might not have been quite as much fun as it was in those days. Now, the teacher might get paid in butter or with a few shillings. And, boy, in those classes there, Peter, what classes did they teach? What subjects was that?
Well, what they did is, of course, they taught Irish in order to preserve the language. They actually taught religion. And, of course, they were teaching the Catholic religion, or because the Bibles weren't as effectively out there, but there was still a theology. They taught mathematics. They taught bookkeeping. And one of the things they were doing with the bookkeeping and the math, you still had to go to the market. And so it was something that enabled them to do it. In some schools, not in all, they taught Latin and Greek. And, of course, I believe the Latin was also being used because of the Catholic faith, and Mass was in Latin, and it gave the students an introduction in what their prayers would mean. But some of the basic subjects that we know, but the ones that would be necessary and to help a child just know more.
And in the port cities, you'll see some classes on navigation come up.
In the port, right. Something that was applicable to their lives, like we do. I mean, if, we go across the United States and you have various colleges that teach various things. In Kansas, we have colleges that teach agriculture and veterinary medicine, especially for animals of husbandry. And so what you have there is, and the same in Ireland, something that would fit the people in the area.
Later on, you'll see the schools were taught, of course, in the English language, but in the beginning, it was part of the national pride and part of the war going on at the time to teach all those classes in the Irish language.
So they used the English because they were realizing that the commerce was becoming more and more dominated by the English, and so they needed to know it, though they still maintained their own language. Like today, Irish is still taught in the schools, and you must, in order to be a teacher in Ireland, you need to know Irish or Gaelic.
They've really done a good job of trying to bring that language back. I don't know what's going to happen in the end, but, I'm getting a little longer than I wanted to get in this, but we might as well go with the flow. Everybody can sit down and come on in and join the class. My great-grandfather, Michael Donahue in County Kerry, was educated in the Hedge Schools, and, I heard those words when I was a child, but nobody really knew with any great depth of what a hedge school was. So that just barely stuck with me, and I remembered it when we came about and started this whole series. And those hedge schools changed, didn't they, Peter? They started out, it was very serious, and you had to be in the open air, and you couldn't even have a building, wasn't even allowed.
Not at all. And so you went by the hedge. And a hedge is a very interesting kind of a tree or a plant, and we all talk about the hedges. I remember growing up with the hedges because our houses had them. But they're very strong, compiling of vegetation in a sense. One time I was walking in Ireland, and the wind was blowing and howling, and I'm walking down a lane, and I'm thinking, I'm hearing this, but I'm not feeling it. And then I realized I was walking between hedges, one on one side of the road, one on the other, and the hedge was about 13 foot high. And so you could hide in them. And there was a dog barking at me, but it was on the other side, but it was so thick that he wouldn't have been able to come through. So the hedges, and by the way, the hague, that's a word for hedge.
Oh, it is. I didn't know that.
And it was how things were put around. It made for not only for decoration, but it made for protection against various things and the weather and people who might be coming onto your land and property. So they did do it by the hedges. They stayed by the hedge, and nobody could see you because they're thick and long. But they also did it in old shacks. In fact, and they also were some in old chapels that were no longer in use because Catholic churches were destroyed. They would go in and have the school in there. Sometimes they would just sit on rocks and make places for them to sit down, and in a cave or a mud shack or a little thatch roof. So even though it maintained the name of hedge, it wasn't always by the hedge row itself. You know?
And as time went on, the laws changed because it started out anybody that owned the land that the building was on where those people met was subject to penalty, so everybody was running a little bit scared, especially in the more populated areas. But I also read there in the beginning, sometimes they would hold classes in what looked like a cattle shed, and they were only 5 feet tall. Now, at first I thought, well, it must have been some problem with the earth there or the rocks where you couldn't stack it over 5 feet tall. It didn't quite make sense to me, and then I kept reading and I said, well, it was like a cattle shed. He said, how could you teach school in something that was only 5 feet high? And the authorities either wouldn't look for you there or they couldn't prosecute you for having a school building on your property.
And the English law, and this came to my attention years ago when I was in the town of Middleton in Cork, northern Cork. And there's a distillery there. But all the windows are bricked in. And we saw that the brick was a different color than the actual building. And we said, well, what's that? Well, the English, in their wise way, here you have a church, here you have houses, they started taxing you on how many windows you had. So when you made a small shack, no openings, that was to avoid the taxation.
Well, yeah, and there was a hearth money tax, I think, where they taxed you on how many fireplaces you might have in the house.
Yes, yeah.
But, as time went on, all of a sudden the laws would let them have a school, and sometimes at first you had to apply for a license to the authorities. Then they did away with that, and it became okay to have a building. So things changed, and you weren't inside all the time. But one of the stories I remember the best that really struck me, it's sort of an Irish way of using a word to represent something else, and it said you might ask somebody in those days if they could read or write. They said, no, I never carried the sod. That was because in those days, if you had school during the winter, and not all places did, or if the weather was inclement, well, then the students were required to bring a couple of sods of turf in, one or two, and put it in the fire. And usually that fireplace was in the middle of the room in those early days. And that kept the class warm. Now, if you didn't bring the turf, some places said you had to stay further away from the fire to teach you a lesson. And I guess that's a lesson I would have remembered. But it also, people could have seen some of the children walking to school every day. And especially if you were a child that wasn't going to school, you thought, what are they doing? That's a strange ritual, They're carrying that sod every morning. And if somebody asked you if you could read or write back in the olden times, and you said, I never carried the sod, well, everybody knew what that meant. You didn't go to school, and we have to remember not everyone did go to school. It really was a luxury, but it was a luxury, one of the few luxuries the Irish were willing to pay for.
And the parents wanted to pass on to the children the whole notion. I was reminded of a story. Everyone is aware of Frank McCourt, who just recently died, who was the author of Angela's Ashes. And in the story, his mother would say, and they were desperately poor when they were living in Ireland, in Limerick, in the city in Limerick, in the lanes is what they called them. They were desperately poor, always having to move. And when the father got a job, he'd drink the money and they wouldn't have enough money for it. But anyway, the mother would save a penny here and there, and she would save it so they could go take Irish dancing lessons. And as I was doing the research and things on hedge schools and how it was also not only an educational experience, it was a cultural experience. The parents wanted their children to remember that they were Irish in light of the English attempting to change your religion, your language, your ways. Yet that carried on. It was so important. You saved it so you could go learn other things, dancing and singing. And remember when you said, no, can you read or write? No, I never carried the sod. One of the other ways that Irish history was also carried down is in the singing of ballads and songs. When you heard it and the melody would get into your mind, and then that would relate for you a historical moment, and you could tell the story through song, even though you would never be able to read it.
They said, well, some of these people were illiterate, but they could sit down and recite their 50s. They could do a song on Irish history as well as any book, and the people really respected it. So it was a different kind of literacy, really.
Oh, absolutely. Reading and writing, of course, in our world today, that's what it is. But they did know. They were wise beyond. They were learned. They just didn't get it from the book. They learned it from someone else, which is an old tradition. Teachers, we use books, but the wisdom of the teacher, the ideas of the teacher is what inspires students. It isn't always what's in the books.
Let's take a look here, Peter, just for a few minutes, at the century in which these hedge schools really got their birth. They really, the seeds of the school was planted. And if you take a look at the 17th century, we've done several shows on the 17th century because of the importance to the Gaelic culture and the people of Ireland, how it affected their history. But if we take a look at that century, we'll see there was terrible wars, the flight of the Earls, the Cromwellian times, and then the Battle of the Boyne, three big things that really ripped the Irish culture apart. And there were Bardic schools in existence in the very beginning of that century in the 1600s. By the end of the 1600s, the Bardic schools were destroyed. The great families that supported them and endowed them were, for the most part, absolutely gone and destroyed. So the Bardic schools really had disappeared for all practical purposes. They had no formal method of education, even though the Bardic schools were very conservative and very limited to a few families. It was at least a form of education. So as that broke up, some of those bards that we were just talking about would end up teaching these hedge schools, which were a whole different thing. It was more of a school for the commoner.
Remember the old saying, necessity is the mother of invention. Well, here come the English. They're trying to say, well, those Irish, they're not worth much anyway. We shouldn't be letting them learn unless they are going to promise to be a part of what our system is. They tried to Anglicize the Irish, and they tried to Protestantize the Irish. Well, the Irish weren't interested in that. The schools, you had to be Protestant to get your land. You had to be Protestant to go to school. You had to be Protestant to teach school. The Irish said, we don't want to do that. We want to have our own. So they did it, and they did it illegally by the laws at the time. They did it, it's almost like an underground school system. And yet that system, because there were so many people who were so educated from before, and even from Europe, they had gone to the continent and learned, and the priests and the seminaries, they brought this education back, and they started to share it, going in almost like a door-to-door thing. Sometimes you would go from village to village, set up a school. And as you've said, Michael, sometimes the students would challenge the master to see who knew more. And when he did, then he could take over the school, and the master then would move on. So you have this almost a transientness to the whole thing, but they were learning at such a wonderful rate. And then the pride of knowing became a part of them. And then they became the next generation of masters in the hedge school.
Now, Now, Peter, I wonder if someone challenges us and they get the better of us. We think we just let it happen on one subject, or they'd have to beat us over a range of subjects over time.
Well, you kind of remind me of the time I was in Ireland and they wanted me to sing, and one guy walks up to me and he says, so you're the singer. He says, I'm challenging you. I said, okay, go ahead. I don't care. And so he challenged me on this song, and we got all through. We were going at it for about a half hour, back and forth, song and song. And I think, if you want to challenge us, go ahead. There's nothing like a great competition. And, Irishmen love a challenge.
Oh, yes. Well, if we take a look there at the state of education in Ireland, there were always a few people who went abroad, and a lot of those were scholars who wrote the great histories of Ireland or participated in it, like the Four Masters and Geoffrey Keating. And they'd go abroad to Louvain or Salamanca or some of the other Irish universities that had been established on the continent. There was a strong tradition of that. Even though it was for the few, those few would come back and spread the word. And, before 1641 and the big Cromwellian troubles that started to brew then, some Catholic laymen, and that's just the laymen, were educated at Trinity College in Dublin, and people like Fergal O'Gara, who sponsored the Four Masters, the Annals of the Four Masters by Michael Clary and that crew, he went to Trinity College, and some of the other gentry, the Irish gentry that had survived, they also went to Oxford. So there was always a little subculture of education, but it was for the few. And then when they outlawed education, that's really when the lower classes got more and more interested, it seems like. And teachers could be imprisoned or fined, and there was rewards for informers. So if someone was walking by the road and said they're teaching house in that class, especially in the beginning, the harshest years, they could be rewarded for tattling on you, and the landowner could be fined or lose part of his land, and you never wanted the authorities looking at you too close.
And the teachers could also have been banished. They sent them to the Barbary Coast.
Or to Clare later.
To Clare. Yeah. They sent you out away. You were not to be there. And because they were, in every sense and in so many cultures, one of the most dangerous things is to educate people. If you keep people ignorant, then they don't know what's happening. The moment they learn it's the seed of all revolution. I know now. And it's the fight between, and for the English, it was this fight, in a sense, between the royalty, the upper class. We know, you don't. We're better. You're nothing. The names they used to call the Irish, and the drudgery of them. They're just animals. They're not worth our time. And if we can save some of them, then it's better for them. But most of them we couldn't care less about. But when the Irish said, okay, fine, leave us alone, we'll do it ourselves, and this constant want on the side of the Irish. And the other thing, the Irish was go to Europe, and the revolutions that were going on in Europe, the Irish are getting more ideas. And so these would filter back. And the English didn't want, they were having their own trouble with Spain and France. They didn't want the Irish knowing what was going on, but the Irish knew. Therefore, we have to outlaw the entire notion of education unless we're in charge of the school. That's why they set up all these diocesan Protestant schools. That's where you'll learn to be a proper Englishman and to be a proper religious man.
Well, and you see a lot of the authorities there said, well, we don't want these guys learning about the Western civilization and the freedom of man and Rome and Greece and some of the higher things that were established then about independence and freedom, because that would make the Irish rise. So, of course, that's what the Irish taught. And you can see it all the time. And one other thing, Peter, I know you're familiar with this. You've probably looked it over, but we've got these schools set up, and they're really against the authorities, and they're really for the Irish, and a lot of them in the Irish language in the beginning. But as time goes on, you'll see some strange things happen, like weren't there a few people where you'll see there were Protestants that were sent to the Irish Hedge Schools? Now, why would that be?
Well, they realized that the level of education in the hedge schools was oftentimes better than in the schools established by the English government and by the English church. And so there's even stories that a young Englishman, they came back, and they were kind of the plantation people. He had come back from studying in Europe and was having difficulty in translating the work that he needed to be done in Greek. And one of the young boys in the town who had been going to the Hedge School did it for him. The Hedge School, they knew. They were learning better. You know, when you're put into a feeling of struggle and you're not the chosen, it's easy to realize that what I'm gaining is worth so much more because I need to struggle for it, rather than some of the English where it was just handed to.
Well, you know, if we stick with the 1600s here and we look at the fall of education, and of course it started to happen around 1640 or so with that Cromwellian, what would become the Cromwellian settlement of Ireland, you can see that there were some openly Catholic schools in operation before that happened. And it was in Irish strongholds like Limerick. Even during the beginning of that struggle, they operated because there were no authorities there to tell them they couldn't, and there wasn't a war going on, so the Irish had their way. But as peace came, an enforced peace, and Protestant rule came about with the penal laws, those schools couldn't operate anymore. So what happened is the city shut down, and this education moved out into the rural areas, and the more rural, the better, because I get the feeling in reading these laws and how they were enforced that not only were some baronies or areas, it wasn't enforced very harshly because the people in charge were kindly towards the Irish, but that there were they didn't care. It was a hit-and-run tactic with these Irish teachers, and if the authorities showed up and started questioning people, they'd head out to the hinterland and start a school up there. Did you find that, Peter?
Absolutely. They moved around, and they would hide. There were places of hiding that you could go into. And the authorities, you know, after the 1640s, when the Cromwellian people came, and Cromwell himself, previous to Cromwell, they really weren't that oppressive on the things that the Irish were doing. They, at times, just let them be, let them do what they want, as long as they don't cause any trouble. The throne, be it in James the First or in Charles the First, they weren't angry at the Irish. It was Cromwell who was angry at the Irish, and that made it so much worse. But they had to move around in order to just safeguard themselves. And it's like anything. If you got a card game going on and somebody hears it, you move your card game over to the next building. And they did this. They moved the school from one place to the other. They were always on the run at times.
Well, yeah, and you know, you mentioned those hidden schools back there in the hinterlands. Well, these hedge schools, as the 17th century or the 18th century came about, they became a part of what people call the hidden Ireland of the 18th century, where things were peaceful on the surface, but the people were still there being educated with their pride, and perhaps they were biding their time. And we look at a few of the letters. Of course, they were always derogatory about these hedge schools if it was the authorities that were talking. And you see them say things like, oh, I saw just a few pitiful hidden Catholic schools in operation at the end of the 17th century, and they only had about 6 students each. So they played it down.
They also tried to destroy the reputation of the teachers in the hedge school when they knew about it. When they couldn't get the hedge school itself, they had to do some personal attacks. And there's old stories that, well, the hedge master, you know, he's a drunk.
Yes.
He's drinking all the time. He's attached to the poachine. And so you can't really trust him. And so that the image, where did the image of this teacher in the society, and for the Irish, a teacher in society was a high-ranking profession. But the English wanted to say, well, they're just a bunch of drunks. I don't know why you're following them, why you should think. And then of course, people who would read this say, well, we better not do that then. It's also discourage other people from joining and to tell those who are in it, you're not worth much in the first place because all you have is a drunk doing your teaching for you.
You know, when I saw the Irish were having a little bit of fun with some of those folks because they knew what the attitude was, and rather to fight them on it and say, no, my teacher's not a drunk, you know, and I'm sure some of the folks had a sip now and then to take the chill off. But the Irish, I saw several instances where the student would say, "Oh yes, he's my favorite teacher. He doesn't drink a little, he drinks a lot. And a matter of fact, the more he drinks, the more we like him." And I think that was a way, really, of using a secret code language to tell these guys they're way off base, but they never knew it. Now, as we look at the fall of the culture in the 1600s, you'll see things like the historian Hardiman said that the war in 1688, which was, I guess, would have been a mopping up action, he said that was the final blow to Irish families, and that it also led to the silence of the national instrument, which the bards used, which, of course, was the harp. And we see an incident in County Cork where a gentleman was having a harper play in his house. That was all. And that was contrary to the act. And that was in County Cork in 1698, and they brought charges up for that. So just merely having a harpist playing in your house was seen as an act of rebellion almost, and that's how sensitive things were at that time. And that, of course, is a time when the Bardic schools were in ruin, and there was nothing to take their place, really. And like we said, that some may have been illiterate, but they weren't uneducated, and many of those could recite volumes of Irish verse, and they were honored by the community. And we read about places like the Diocese of Armagh and Ossory. And there in the beginning, and they say for about 3.5 years, in one letter we read, it was involving Blessed Oliver Plunkett. And he was saying he had success around 1672 with an educational institution. His main school was at Drogheda, and he had 150 Catholic and 40 Protestant sons of the gentry, which really surprises you if you haven't studied the whole thing. Now, this didn't leave Protestants, teachers, and administrators very happy at all, because the hedge schools were outperforming the established schools, so to speak. So it was good for a while, but I tell you, it couldn't last. And 1 year after his hopeful report, he was in hiding, and we read a letter saying that they were sleeping in straw under the stars, and a quote was, "Our house is made of straw, and every slightest shower refreshes us."
But also, the whole notion, some of Protestants went to the hedge schools to teach. And in the writings, it says, if we found one of these, we then assumed he was a popish. They were using that funny word, popish, or a follower of the Pope. And so the hedge school became then very much attached to the church, even though it came into conflict with the church. It's remarkable about some of the things. And the Protestants started sending their children there because they felt they were going to get a better education. When we were talking, you talking about I never carried the turf, and how they were 5 foot tall and the floor was down, and how the schoolmaster, they were being continually said they were nothing but drunks, reminded me of a little song that was out there. And it even talked to him. It goes, "When I was a gossoon of 8 years or so, with me turf and me primer, to school I did go. Hi-dee-dee-dum-dee-dee-day. I went to a schoolhouse without any floor, where lay the schoolmaster blind drunk, oh blind drunk on the floor. Hi-dee-dee-dee-dee-dee-dee-dee-dee."
So ends this chapter of Irish History from the Hedgerow. The entire series is available at www.irishroots.com. We have broadcast series on genealogy, song, local history, as well as original publications for every county in Ireland. The hedge school in Ireland was totally reliant upon the local community to survive, just as we are here today in our modern-day hedge school. If you believe in what we are doing for your community, please do send us your support. You can sponsor a session of Irish Hedgerow history for as little as $100 and become a recognized scholar of the hedge. You will also receive a pass or letter of introduction from the instructors here at the school, as was the custom of the hedgerow. So keep the hedge growing with your donation, subscription, or membership. Thank you. We have been available for speaking engagements, exhibits, tours, and educational events since 1984. You can reach us at the Irish Roots Cafe on Twitter and Facebook, and on our homepage at www.irishroots.com, by mail at our U.S. location, the Irish Roots Cafe, Box 7575, Kansas City, Missouri 64116. Leave a message on our phone recorder at 816-256-3360. Copyright 2009.